Today's notes are on 6.4. Graphing sine and cosine functions. Now, if you are given an ordered pair, x and y, keep in mind that the x is the cosine value and the y is the sine value. So we're going to start off by graphing y equals the sine of x. Remember, x is the argument, okay? X is the argument. Now, if we're going to graph this, I'm going to say x and y, or if the argument is, we've been using theta a lot, that's the same as the x. I'm going to graph it at 0, at pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So if you look on your unit circle, you are looking at the y values on the unit circle. The y value at 0 is a 0. The y value at pi over 6 is a 1/2. The y value at pi over 4 is going to be a square root of 2 over 2, which is approximately 0.7. The y value at pi over 2 is going to be a 1, 0, -1, and 0. Now, this is where I'm getting the values from. Here's my unit circle, and I'm looking at the y values. Look at the y at pi over 6 was 1/2. The y at pi over 4 is a square root of 2 over 2, which was approximately 0.7. The y value at pi over 2 was 1. This is where I'm pulling all the y values off of the unit circle. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to graph this. And if you notice the y values, the highest it goes is up to 1 and the lowest it goes is to -1. So the highest is going to go is to +1, the lowest is going to go to -1. I'm going to go by pi over half. That's pi. This is 3 pi over 2. So it's 1 pi over 2. 2 pi over 2 reduces 3 pi over 2. This is 4 pi over 2, which reduces to 2 pi. And I'm going to start plugging in my points. At 0, it's at 0. At pi halves, it was at 1. At pi, it was at 0. At 3 pi over 2, oh, this is 0. At 3 pi over 2, it's a -1. And at 2 pi, it's 0. Now, don't just connect the lines with the dots with straight lines, because right here at pi over 6, it was about a half of the way, which is like right here. And then at pi over 4, which is half of this, it was at pi over 7. So what's happening is it's actually making a curve. A curve. Now, this is going to be one cycle. This is going to be one cycle, which is equal to 2 pi. Now, amplitude. Amplitude is basically how high is it going. Now, do not say the amplitude is 2. The amplitude is actually 1. One thing about amplitude is always positive. Now, all of your sine graphs will always look like this. I want you to remember these 5 points. Where does it start at? Where does it end at? Next, it's going to cross the x-axis in the middle of the two. And between the first two, it's going to reach a maximum. And between the last two, it's going to reach a minimum. All of your sine graphs will look like this, something like this. Now, our cycle might change and our amplitude might change. Now, let's write some important facts here. So right here, my maximum is going to be 1. My minimum is going to be -1. My maximum is going to be 1. Minimum is going to be -1. Now the midline, this is called the midline. And midline is basically what is separating it right here. That's cutting it in half. That is known as your midline. Your midline is always going to be this equation. It's going to be y equals the maximum plus the minimum divided by 2. So right here, the maximum was 1 plus the minimum was -1 divided by 2, which is just going to be a 0/2. So that's y equals 0. So the midline is y equals 0. You could have actually pulled it off of the graph. The amplitude is going to be the absolute value of the maximum minus the minimum divided by 2. So in this case, the maximum was 1 minus the minimum, which is a -1. 2 negatives make a positive. So I'm like, what the absolute value of 2/2, which is just equal to 1. Now, remember what I said? The amplitude is always positive. Amplitude is always positive. Okay, now your period. Period is basically the length of one cycle. So right here, my period is equal to 2 pi. So this is also known as the period. Now on this one, my period is 2 pi. Now that is going to be changing, and we'll get into that. And then frequency is the reciprocal of the period. So right here, my frequency is going to be 1/2 pi. My domain here. This is going to keep repeating itself. Every x value will exist. So it's going to be from -infinity to +infinity. Or you write it so that you can write it in interval, or you can write it as inequality. Now the range, look at the range. The range only goes down in -1 and it goes up to +1. So the range here is going to be from -1 to +1, and it's including those points. As an inequality, it's -1 is less than or equal to y is less than or equal to +1. All right, that's the graph of sine. That's the graph of sine. Keep in mind, sine starts at 0, ends at 0. I'm going to go ahead now and do the cosine one. Here's our x and our y. I'm going to use 0 pi/6 pi/4 pi over 3, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Now, our unit circle, cosine is the x values. So the x value right here is going to be the number 1. So at 0, it's a 1. At pi over 4, here's pi over 4, that's square root of 2 over 2, which is going to be approximately 0.7. If I look at pi over 2, pi over 2, the x value is going to be a 0. At pi, the x value is a negative 1. At 3 pi over 2, the x value is a 0. And at 2 pi, the x value is a 1. Pi over 6. At pi over 6, the x value is square root of 3 over 2. Square root of 3 over 2 is approximately 0.9. Pi over 3. Pi over 3 is right here. The x value is the 1/2, which is 0.5. I'm going to go ahead and graph this. And if you notice, the highest is going to go to is positive 1. The lowest is going to go to is negative 1. Highest is going to go to positive 1. Lowest is going to go as negative 1. I'm going to go by pi over 4s. Pi halves, sorry. 1 pi half, 2 pi halves is pi, 3 pi halves, 4 pi halves is 2 pi. At 0, it's at 1. At pi over 2, it's at 0. At pi, it's at negative 1. At 3 pi over 2, it's at 0. And at 2 pi, it's at 1. Pi over 4 is in between here, and it's at 0.7, which is up here somewhere. Pi over 3 is right here, and that's going to be a 1/2. Once again, it's going to make a curve, not straight lines. It's going to make a curve. So right here, my amplitude is again going to be a 1. My period or my cycle, this is 1 cycle, which is equal to 2 pi, which is the same as a period. Now you have to remember these 5 points for the cosine. Cosine starts at 1, ends at 1. It has a minimum halfway, which means it crosses the x-axis halfway in between. Now look how similar it looks to the sine graph. The sine starts at 0, ends at 0, and it does that. But cosine starts at 1, ends at 1. So they are very, very similar. Let's go ahead and let's write our important facts down. The maximum is going to be at 1. The minimum is going to be at negative 1. Our midline. Here's the midline again. That's the midline. The midline equation is going to be y equals the max plus the min divided by 2, which is 1 plus negative 1 divided by 2, which once again is y is 0. The amplitude is the absolute value of the max minus the min divided by 2, which is maximum is 1 minus the minimum is negative 1. That makes a plus sign, so I'm left with absolute value of 2 over 2, which is equal to 1. And like before, the amplitude is always positive. The period here is the length of 1 cycle. So here, my period is equal to 2 pi. And the frequency is the reciprocal again. Frequency is the reciprocal of the period, which is 1 over 2 pi. Now the domain here is going to go, because it's going to continue on, it's negative infinity to positive infinity. You don't even have to put the positive there, actually. The range, again, is only going to go from -1 to +1. So everything is the same as in the sine graph. Let's get into a little bit of transformations. In general, you're going to have y equal a. Now you're going to have the trig value right here. And then we're going to have a bx. Now, the trig value that we're only going to be dealing with in this section is only going to be the sine and cosine. There is more trig, but we're going to focus on sine and cosine. The A is going to be the amplitude. So basically from the midline, how high up and how down are you going to go from the midline? Because remember, the amplitude is from the midline. So right here, you're at the A in the very front, in front of the trig being multiplied. That's going to be the amplitude. And it has to be a positive value. So say that's a -2, the amplitude is still going to be a +2. And then the period is going to be the value between the trig and the argument. Okay, well, it is the argument between the trig and the variable. That's going to be the period, which whatever number that is. And the period is going to be equal to 2 pi divided by b. The A is a vertical stretch or shrink affects the amplitude, which is the y-axis. Now the B value is a horizontal stretch or shrink. That affects the period. Which is the x-axis. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and grab some of these. I'm going to be changing the amplitude and the period. So remember, the amplitude is the number in front of the trig. Between the trig and the variable is going to be the period change. And then keep in mind, where does sine start at? Where does cosine start at? Cosine starts at 1, ends at 1. And then remember, it has a minimum halfway, crosses the x-axis halfway. With the sine starts at 0, ends at 0, and it crosses the x-axis halfway, and then it goes up and then down. So I'm going to be referring back to the parent graphs of sine and cosine. We're going to sketch and find key features. So right here, the number in the very front is going to be the amplitude. That is the amplitude. So that means from the midline, I have to go 5 up and 5 down. And then between the trig and the trig and the variable, that's going to be the b term. So the b is equal to 1/2. Now that had to do with the period change. And the period is equal to 2 pi divided by whatever the b value is. So 2 pi divided by the b value, which in this case, the b value is the 1/2. So it's going to be a 2 pi divided by 1/2, where the 2 flips up to the top. So I'm just up with 4 pi. So you're going to start at 0 and end at 4 pi. Now this is the sine graph, okay? So let's go up to 4 pi. Always do 4 markings. I need to end at 4 pi. So the fourth marking has to be 4 pi. Now, how do I find out what the scale is? Well, take the period and divide it by 4. 4 pi divided by 4 is going to be pi. So that means that each increment is going by pi. 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. Now the amplitude is 5. That means I have to go up to 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because your midline is going to be right in the middle. Now for sine, let's look at the parent graph of sine. On the parent graph of sine, it started at 0 and ended at 0. So right here, it's going to start at 0 and end at 0. Then it crossed the x-axis halfway in between. Cross the x-axis halfway in between. Reached a maximum halfway here and a minimum halfway here. So here, halfway in between, the maximum is going to be 5. So it's going to look like this. The minimum is going to be -5. It's going to look like this. Always go back to your parent graph. So right here's your amplitude. My amplitude is 5. And my period, or one cycle, equals 4 pi. It looks almost identical to the sine graph. The only difference is I changed the scale. Here I went all the way up to 5. Here was only 1. And then my x's, each increment was going by pi, where the original went by pi halves. So they are going to still look the same. You're just changing the scale. And you must label your scale, because if you don't, it's going to be automatically wrong. Now let's go ahead and let's say, list some key features here. The maximum is going to be a 5. The minimum is going to be -5. My amplitude is going to be 5. My period is going to be a 4 pi. And how do you calculate the period? You do 2 pi divided by the b value. And the b value is between the trig and the variable. Now, your frequency is the reciprocal of the period. So it's 1/4 pi. My midline is y equals 0 here. My domain is going to be from -infinity to +infinity. Now, all of these will always be -infinity to +infinity unless they restrict it. Your range is going to change though, because the range, it goes up to 5, down to -5. Let's graph a cosine one. Okay, on this one, we have y equals 1/3 cosine 3 pi x. So the very front, this is going to be my amplitude. So my amplitude is 3/2, which is about 1. It's 1.5 actually. Amplitude is 3/2, which is the same as 1/2. This is your B value. Your B value is 3 pi. Because remember, the B value is what's between the trig and the x. Period is equal to 2 pi divided by B. So since the B is 3 pi, I'm going to put that 2 pi divided by 3 pi. Because the B is 3 pi. So here the pi's cancel out, and I'm just left with a 2/3. So since the period is 2/3, I'm basically going to go to 2/3 and to do 4 markings in between. Like right here, my period was 4 pi, and I divided by 4, and that's what each marking was. So I'm going to definitely need 4 markings. The last marking is going to be the 2/3. And then my amplitude is going to be 3/2, which is a 1/2. So here's the 1, here's a 2. So I'm just going to go half the way. Here's -1, -2. I'm just going to go half the way. So I'm only going to go up to 1.5 and down to 1.5. Now the markings right here, your scale. If I take 2/3, and I divide it by 4, that's actually going to be a 2/3 times 4 in the denominator. So that's actually a 2/12, which is a 1/6. So each increment here is going by 1/6. So this is 1/6, 2/6, 3/6, and then this is technically a 4/6. And 4/6 does reduce to 2/3. 3/6, that actually reduces to 1/2. So that's actually a half. You can leave it as 3/6 if you want. 2/6, that's actually a 1/3. That's how you're going to figure out your scale. So here's my period. One cycle is equal to 2/3, which is the same as a period. Cosine. Cosine started at 1, ended at 1. But here we're not starting at 1, we're starting at 1.5. So it's going to start up here and end up here at 1.5. 1.5 is a little higher. And then remember, cosine, it had a minimum halfway, and then it crossed the x-axis halfway. So right here, halfway is going to be the 1/3. That's where it's going to reach the minimum, and the minimum is going to be 1.5. And then across the x-axis halfway, halfway. And here's your amplitude. The amplitude is 3/2 or 1.5. Here's my midline. So the max here is going to be 3/2. The minimum here is going to be -3/2. The amplitude is the 3/2. Now the period here, the period is going to be the 2/3. And for the frequency, you are doing the reciprocal, which is going to be 3/2 now. The midline is y equals 0. The domain is from -infinity to +infinity. Like I said, for sine and cosine, that's always going to stay the same. Now your range has to do with the amplitude. It goes down to -3/2 and up to +3/2. Let's go ahead and graph another one, more practice. All right. Right here, we have a negative in the very, very front. Like always, that negative is actually going to be a reflection across the x-axis. So on sine, instead of going up and then down, it's actually going to go down and then up because all it's doing is a reflection across the x-axis. So that's the only thing that negative is going to do. Instead of going up first, it's going to go down first. It's still going to create the same type of cycle. So this negative is going to be a reflection across the x-axis. The 2 is still going to be the amplitude. Amplitude is always positive. Don't ever say amplitude is -2. This is going to be your B value right here, which has to do with the period change. And the period is 2 pi divided by B, which in this case is 2 pi divided by 2. So it's going to be a pi. So let's go ahead and draw my axis. I'm going to go 4 notches, 1, 2, 3, 4, with the ending going to be a pi. Now I'm going to take pi and divide it by 4. So that's 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4. And 2 pi over 4 is actually pi halves. My amplitude is going to be 2. So I have to go up to 2 and down to 2. Sine. Sine starts at 0, ends at 0. And then remember, it went up and then down. So it did cross the x-axis halfway in between. Now, the amplitude is going to be 2. However, because it's reflecting across the x-axis, instead of going up to 2, it's actually going to go down to 2 first and then up to 2. So this is still going to be our midline. Here is my amplitude. Here is my period or my cycle. So my maximum here is going to be a 2. My minimum is going to be a -2. The amplitude is going to be a 2. And then my period is going to be pi, which makes the frequency the reciprocal, which is 1 over pi. The midline is y equals 0. My domain is from -infinity to +infinity. And now my range, it goes down to -2 and up to +2. All right, on the next one, I'm going to change it up a bit. I'm actually going to give you the graph and ask for the equation. So state the equation to the given function. All right. right there. The easiest one to tell is the amplitude, okay? Because I can already see that this is my midline. I don't know if this is sine or cosine yet. So the easiest one I could tell is my amplitude. My amplitude is going to be a 3. Next, I had to determine, is it a sine or a cosine? Well, it's not starting at the 0 and ending at the 0, okay? Because if you're looking at it, one cycle is right here. That's one cycle or one period. And that's going to be equal to 6 pi. So since it's starting up here and ending up here, that has to be a cosine graph. It could actually be a sine graph if we shifted it, but we're not going to be covering left and right shifting. So this is going to be y equals a cosine of bx. I already know what the a is. That's the amplitude. The amplitude is 3. So this is y equals 3 cosine. Now I need to find out what the b is. Now remember that the period was equal to 2 pi divided by b. Well, I know what the period is. The period is 6 pi. So I'm going to plug a 6 pi right here. I am trying to solve for the letter b now, so I could plug that in. I'm going to go ahead and multiply both sides by b. So then I get a b times a 6 pi equals 2 pi. I'm solving for b, so I'm going to divide both sides by 6 pi. So b ends up equaling, the pi's cancel out, and 2 over 6 is 1/3. So the b is actually a 1/3. So this is 1/3 x. And this is 2 cycles. There's 1 cycle, 2 cycles. And look at 6 pi plus 6 pi is 12 pi, and that is ending at 12 pi. All right. Last part of the notes. We have the average rate of change. The change in y over the change in x. That is basically the slope formula. y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. It is the slope formula. All right. So we are going to graph the function. And find what is the frequency. What is the average rate of change over the interval from 0 to pi? So interval, I'm only graphing from 0 to pi, okay? Only from 0 to pi. That's all I'm going to look for, the slope between 0 and pi. Y equals 5 sine of 1/2 x. So 5 is your amplitude. This is the b value, which has to do with the period. And the period is 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi divided by 1/2. The 2 is going to flip up to the top. So the period is 4 over pi. So when I graph this out, I need to make sure I go all the way up to 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to go out to 4 pi. Always do 4 notches. 4 pi divided by 4 is going to be pi. So each increment is going to be pi. Here's your midline. Sine. Sine started at 0, ended at 0. And remember, it goes up and then down. So it's going to cross the x-axis halfway, reach halfway. So it goes up like this, halfway, it goes down like this. Now, the first part of the question says, what is the frequency? Remember that the frequency is the reciprocal of the period. So instead of a 4 pi, it's 1 over 4 pi. There's the frequency. Now we are looking for the average rate of change. Now you're going to do the average rate of change on the interval from 0 to pi. So 0 to pi, that's this interval right here. So basically, you're going to be using these 2 points, and you are looking for the slope between these 2 points right here. Now this point is going to be a 0, 0. And right here at pi, that's going to be pi 5. So when you're finding your average rate of change, it's given by these 2 points. You're basically doing f of x2 minus f of x1 over x2 minus x1. Given these 2 points right here, we have 0, 0, and pi 5. This is the same as saying y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So y2 is going to be a 5, minus y1 is a 0, x2 is a pi, minus x1 is a 0. So the average rate of change here is going to be 5 over pi. So that's the slope going on right here. And look, this is one period or one cycle. This is your amplitude of 5. And I don't know if you noticed, but right here, when they give you the interval, that happens to be the x1, that happens to be the x2, because you're only going from 0 to pi. Let's do a cosine one. Last one. Right here, my amplitude is 3. This is my b value. That's going to be my period. My period is equal to 2 pi divided by b, which is a 2 pi divided by 2, which is just a pi. So I'm going to go up to 3, down to -3. And then I have my 4 notches, where the 4th notch is the pi. So if I take pi and I divide it by 4, that's 1 pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 is actually pi halves. 3 pi over 4. Now cosine. Cosine started at the top and ended at the top. Started at the top, ended at the top. And then it went down and then up. So it reaches a minimum right here, crosses the x-axis right there. So let's go and start answering the frequency. The frequency is the reciprocal of the period. So that's 1 over pi. And now you are looking for the slope between 0 and pi. So this point right here is x is 0, y is 3. Here, x is pi, y is 3. So you're technically looking at this right here, which just by the graph, I can tell that that's a 0. But let's go ahead and let's calculate it. Average rate of change. The y2 is going to be the 3. Subtract the y1 is going to be the 3. X1 is going to be the pi. Subtract x2, and then x1 is a 0. So that's 0 over pi, which is just a 0. Once again, this is your period or your one cycle. And this is your amplitude. And that concludes our notes.